This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, Agun Erev Shabbos, everyone. Aguten Chodesh. Chodesh Elul. Parshas Shoftim. Now, the insights and imponderables of Parshas Shoftim had a special siyata d'shmaya. And let me tell you what happened. So I just came back from Panama last night, this morning, at about 1 a.m. And in order for these chidushim to be typed up, I have to send it to the typist, before midnight. The problem was I was landing after midnight, so I had to finish it up, basically driving to the airport yesterday, and in the airport, and on the plane. And I was racing against the clock to be able to finish up before the plane takes off, because once the plane takes off, I can't scan it anymore and email it. So I was finishing off. I was on the plane, and the plane was scheduled to take off, and Baruch Hashem, our tefillos were answered that the plane did not take off until these chidushim were finished being written. Literally, as the plane started going, I sent it off, and I was, it wasn't going through so easily because the connection was very spotty. And then I got confirmation it went through, and Baruch Hashem, when I landed, it was already typed up. So Baruch Hashem. So I wanted to thank. I told the person who was taking care of us, Rabbi Isaac Antaby, that I would mention. I told him the first of the imponderables in the car. But Baruch Hashem, they're all able to go to print. So let's begin with the some ideas on the Parsha, Parshas Shoftim. Okay, the pasuk says, "V'kamta v'alisa." You're going to go up, you're going to get up, and you're going to go up. So Rashi says, why is going to the Yerushalayim, the Beis Hamikdash, called going up? What if you're coming from the Rocky Mountains? What if you're coming from the Catskills? What if you're coming from Mount Everest or Denali? Who knows where you're coming from? Why is it V'kamta v'alisa? Says Rashi, Melamed, Shebeis Hamikdash gavaya mikol hamakaymes. The highest spot in the world is the Beis Hamikdash. Now, obviously, that is subject to understanding, because most topographers would say there are higher mountains than Har HaMoriah. But Sam Sofer says, when you have the world is round, so it all depends on the vantage point. Any spot on a ball, you could say it's the highest spot if you're holding it in a way where that spot is on top. In other words, Yam HaMelach could be the tallest place in the world if you're holding the globe in a way where Yam HaMelach's on the top. So from the vantage point that Einei Hashem Elokecha Bai, Yerushalayim, this is the highest spot in the world. So here's my simple question. There's a big Torah out there. Why does the Torah choose to tell us that Yerushalayim is the highest spot in the world, Dafka now, in Parshas Shoftim, regarding going up to the Sanhedrin Hagdolah? In other words, this does not seem to be specifically connected to the inyan of, we're talking about somebody who has a question about judgment, blood, Yaredeya, din ladin, choshe mishpat, nega la nega, tuma v'tara. So, why in this context does it have to say the Beis Hamikdash is the highest spot in the world? Perhaps we could say as follows. We know that Avira da'ara machkim, the air of Eretz Yisrael, makes one wise. L'chayra, then, as great as Avira da'ara is, Avira d'Yerushalayim is even greater. After all, the Navi tells us, Ki mitzia in Teitzei Torah. Why? Why mitzia in Teitzei Torah? Well, a part of it is Avira da'ara. Now, why is Avira da'ara machkim? What's better about Avira da'ara? Presumably, it's because it's more elevated. Because Eretz Yisrael gavaya mikol haratzos. So even that, if that's not a scientific description, but spiritually, Eretz Yisrael is higher than any land, and therefore its avir is more spiritually conducive. And in that case, Yushalayim's avir is even greater. And then, the Makom HaMikdash, if it's Gavoya Mikol Ha'aratzos, in other words, if the highest spot on the world is the Beis HaMikdash, it must have the most powerful spiritual avir. Now we understand why the Torah tells this to us, dafka here. Because we're talking about somebody who doesn't know what to do in halacha. So he might say, okay, so I don't know, nobody knows. So you say, no, go to a place where they might have more chachma than you. He says, where's that? Go to Yerushalayim, go to the Beis Hamikdash. Say, wow, why would they know more than I know? Because they're in a makom that's gavaya mikol ha'aratzos and memela is better avir, and the avir of the makom ha'mikdash is machgim yoiser than where you go, than where you hang out. Okay. Next I want to share with you just a very simple thought, which is definitely somewhat dangerous. So, use at your own caution. And it's as follows. It says, Lo silmad la'asais. Yud ches parak tes. Lo silmad la'asais. Don't learn about the avodah zarah of the nations of the world. Don't learn about how they worship avodah zarah. Ki ata ba'al ha'aretz asher Hashem Elokecha nosen lach lo silmad la'asais. So Chazal famously say, you're not allowed to learn to serve the avodah zarah, but you are allowed to learn to be able to paskin and to know, did this person in fact worship the avodah zarah? Did this person not worship the avodah zarah? Okay, I think we're all familiar with that. That Beis Din has to be familiar with various forms of avodah zarah in order to know whether somebody's innocent or guilty. But Rashi adds to what Chazal say. Rashi adds, don't learn to serve the avodah zarah, but you could learn to understand it, to understand how corrupt it is, how empty it is. Why? Why is it important to know how empty it is? To teach your children, don't do that. That's what the Gentiles do. That's a step forward than what is commonly thought. Commonly it's thought the Sanhedrin is given license to learn about certain things in order to be able to paskin halacha l'maisa. But this is not for the average Joe. Rashi seems to be saying that every single Jew has to have an awareness. This is not just an authorization. Don't learn, but if you want, you could learn to be able to explain to your children. It seems like maybe this is considered ideal, where a person should have some understanding of the emptiness of the nations of the world in order to explain why in fact it's empty and wrong and problematic. Now I think this is very dangerous, but this is what Rashi is saying. Rashi is saying that on some level, we have to know how it applies, where it applies, when it applies, on some level, one should have a understanding. In other words, let's say, just to give you a general example, obviously there's certain forms of technology that are very harmful. Obviously there's certain reading material which is very harmful. If a parent had no idea what it was even, he would not be able to tell his children, stay away from that. The kid said, what do you know about that? You don't even know what it is. But if the parent knows what it is, the parent could explain, look, this is wrong. This does not meet our standards. Rashi seems to be saying that there is an idea, not just for Beis Din, that every parent has to be aware to some extent of certain things. And I'm not here to tell you what the guidelines are and what the information that you need to know is. But it seems like a parent has to be educated in certain ways of the world just in order to mechanech their children. Who says that? Rashi. See for yourself. Okay. What's the Ari Miklat doing in this week's Parsha? What is the Ari Miklat doing in this week's Parsha? Why dafka now do we have the mitzvah of Ari Miklat? And I think that's also very simple. The Arizal tells us that Chodesh Elul is compared to an Ari Miklat. The remez to Chodesh Elul is Ina liyadai v'samti l'cha makayim. Elul is considered a city of refuge. We know that more than any month of the year, there are ramazim to Elul, right? There's so many ramazim to Elul. Ina liyadai v'samti l'cha. Es levavcha v'yes levav. Ish l'rayehu matanas le'avyanum. Uva l'tziyayin gai el ul shave pesha. There are literally dozens and dozens of ramazim to the word Elul all over the Chumash and all over the davening. And you're not going to find ramazim to Tammuz and to Tishrei and to Cheshvan. Why so many ramazim to Elul? Because Elul is an Arei Miklat, and there's a mitzvah for an Arei Miklat. You have to have signs everywhere. There, go there. The Arei Miklat is there. Therefore, there's a remez to Elul everywhere. And that's why Davka and Shoftim, the beginning of Chodesh Elul, we read about the Arei Miklat. Very interesting. The end of the Parsha, we have the prohibition of cutting down a fruit tree. The prohibition of cutting down a fruit tree. You know, it's very problematic to move into a house and in the backyard, smack in the middle, you have a fruit tree. It's a problem. You don't want it there. Maybe the fruits aren't good. Maybe they're not edible. Maybe they're infested. And, what do you do? But you're not allowed to cut down a fruit tree. And right after that, we have the episode of a dead body is found slain, and they take a cow and they break the back of its neck. And what type of cow? An egla bashnasa, a 1-year-old cow. Rashi said something that was very telling to me, and I think would explain the juxtaposition of the subjects at the end of the Parsha. Hashem says, you know why you take a calf 1-year-old? Because the calf never produced peros. Cut its neck in a land that was never worked, that never produced peros, to atone for the fact that you killed someone who was not able to bring progeny into the world. So it seems like when the Beis Din is held to be responsible for the dead body, we emphasize the fact you're going to break the back of the neck of a cow that never produced progeny in a place that no trees, nothing ever grew, in order to atone for the fact that this person was not allowed to produce fruits. This would explain, Rabbi Glatstein, the juxtaposition of Egla Arufa and not cutting down a fruit tree. The Torah seems to be telling us about the importance of something that has the ability to produce, needs to produce, and you can't stop it from producing. The function of being in this world is to produce peros. The Malbim writes in Parshas Noach, Eila todos Noach, Noach ish tzaddik, Tamim haya b'dayroisav, es holakim es halach Noach. That fruits in this world does not just mean actual progeny, although that's the physical fruits of a person. But a person has to produce fruits in society. A person has to contribute to the Jewish community. What do you do for the tzibor? A person has to produce fruits in his ethical behavior. In other words, a person has to be productive. The Sfarim even tell us, Chidushei Torah is a form of procreation. Therefore, we have to be careful not to cut down the fruit tree. God created everything is supposed to be productive. I remember now, Rav Miller used to say a very difficult pasuk, Asher bara Elokim la'asos, that God created to do. And the Mefarshim struggle. What does it mean, God created to do? And Rav Miller would explain, God created man to produce. Our objective in this world is to produce. And God created creations that they should produce. And therefore the Torah warns us not to cut down the fruit tree. And that's why immediately after that, the emphasis on finding the dead body is that he was not allowed to produce in this world. And that's how we don't just say, you're responsible for his death, but we emphasize, the nakuda we emphasize is, look, you've mitigated this person's opportunity to produce in this world. Okay, so these are the chidushim on Shoftim, and now some imponderables.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.